Welcome to the Discover Bittensor podcast. My name is Nick, and the objective of this podcast is very simple: help normal people understand Bittensor. And today we're going to talk about something that sits right at the very heart of the Bittensor system: the TAO token. What is it? Why does it exist? Why does Bittensor need it? And why do people sometimes compare it to Bitcoin? And why do some people believe it could become extremely valuable over time? To really understand TAO, we actually need to zoom out first. Because this episode is not just about a token, it's about incentives, about money, it's about how work gets organized. And in a deeper sense, it's also about a much bigger idea. Bittensor is not just trying to build AI, it's trying to build a new way of organizing productive work on the internet. That to me is the real story here. So let's start there. The first misunderstanding people often have about TAO is actually very simple. When someone hears about Bittensor for the first time, he or she often thinks, okay, Bittensor is the project, and TAO is the token attached to the project. In other words, the token is imagined as a kind of accessory. The machine is the real thing, and the token is the little badge hanging off the side. But in Bittensor, that mental model is basically backwards. TAO is not decoration, it's not branding, it's not some optional crypto ornament sprinkled on top because apparently every system in this industry must come with a ticker symbol. No. TAO is much closer to the monetary engine of the system. It flows through the network, it rewards miners, it shapes incentives, and it routes capital between different parts of the ecosystem. And it turns participation in the network from something ideological into something economic. So the real question is not what does the token do on top of Bittensor. The real question is something deeper. What kind of network actually needs a native monetary layer in order to function? And once you ask that question, the design of Bittensor starts to make much more sense. To understand why TAO exists, we first need to understand what Bittensor is trying to solve. And the original Bittensor white paper is quite clear about this. It starts from a simple observation. Machine intelligence is becoming one of the most valuable resources in the modern world. But the way we organize its production is still very centralized. Today, if you want to build powerful AI systems, you typically need enormous resources. You need massive amounts of compute, you need large teams, you need capital. Which means most of the best AI development ends up happening inside large organizations and major tech companies, such as OpenAI or Anthropic. That creates a kind of concentration. On one side, you have giant labs with massive budgets. On the other side, you have open source communities, which are often incredibly creative and brilliant, but historically struggle with incentives. Open source is amazing at solving the permission problem. Anyone can contribute, anyone can build, but it has often been weaker at solving the economic problem. Linux is the classic example. Linux changed the entire world, but you couldn't really own a piece of Linux itself. The economic value appeared around it. Hosting companies, consulting firms, cloud providers, enterprise services, but not directly inside the protocol. So Bittensor asks a different question. Instead of organizing AI development through companies or loose volunteer communities, could we organize it through a market? A peer-to-peer market where useful machine intelligence is continuously produced, evaluated, and rewarded by the network itself. That's the core idea. Not, let's build another AI company, but can we create a market where intelligence itself becomes a kind of digital commodity? And as soon as you try to build a market, you need a native unit of economic coordination. You need money inside the system, and that money is TAO. This is also where the comparison with Bitcoin becomes interesting, because one of the most revolutionary things Bitcoin introduced was not just digital money, it was a new way of organizing work. Think about how Bitcoin mining actually functions. There is no Bitcoin headquarters hiring miners. There are no job interviews. Nobody sends out employment contracts saying, congratulations, you are now senior vice president of hashing. No. Instead, Bitcoin does something much simpler. It defines rules. If you perform the work that secures the network, you receive a reward. That's it. Bitcoin doesn't manage labor. It designs incentives. And if the incentives are strong enough, people all over the world organize themselves into a massive machine that performs useful work for the network. Bittensor takes that same organizational logic and applies it to a very different domain. Instead of securing a ledger, the goal is producing useful machine intelligence. And more actually, but mostly this. So the similarity looks like this. Bitcoin says, do useful work for the network by securing the ledger. Bittensor says, do useful work for the network by producing digital commodities, models, compute, predictions, data, agents, and get rewarded if that work is judged valuable. That's why the Bitcoin comparison is meaningful. But it's also why Bittensor is not just Bitcoin with AI on top, because deciding what counts as useful intelligence is far more complicated than deciding whether a hash is valid, which means the incentive system has to do much more complicated coordination. And this leads to one of the most interesting aspects of Bittensor. It's not just a token system, and it's not just an AI network. It's actually an experiment in a new labor model. In the traditional corporate structure, work is organized in a very specific way. A company raises capital, it hires employees, it manages internal teams, it runs experiments internally, and it carries all the overhead that comes with that: salaries, HR, management layers, coordination costs. Bittensor proposes a different structure. Instead of hiring people directly, the protocol defines a problem. Then it defines how solutions will be evaluated. Then it creates incentives. And globally distributed participants compete to produce the best results. No employment contracts, no HR department, no meeting where 12 people spend 45 minutes debating whether the phrase AI initiative should be replaced by strategic AI directionality framework. The protocol does not hire labor, it prices useful behavior. And if the incentive design works, people organize themselves around those incentives. And that's a radically different organizational logic. It turns experimentation into an open competitive arena instead of a closed internal process. Now, this is where emissions become extremely important, because emissions are what allow the protocol to fund work. Bitcoin already demonstrated this model. New tokens are issued. Those tokens reward the behavior that secures the network. The system becomes self-sustaining. In Bitcoin, the rewarded work is hashing. In Bittensor, the vision is much broader. Miners produce digital commodities. Validators evaluate those outputs. Subnet creators or owners design incentive arenas. And TAO is continuously emitted across the network. So the protocol creates a stream of economic energy that can be directed toward productive work, not by a manager, not by a venture capitalist, but by the rules of the network itself. It's in the code. And for someone building a subnet, those emissions can function almost like a protocol-funded R&D budget. You define the problem, you define the evaluation system, you define the incentives, and then the network starts pulling in experimentation and competition from across the globe. That is a very different innovation model. And things get even more interesting with the newer subnet architecture. Today, subnet emission share is influenced by TAO flows. In simple terms, people can stake TAO into different subnets, and those flows help determine how much emission energy each subnet receives. So the system is not centrally deciding which subnet deserves more attention. Instead, capital expresses conviction. The market decides. If participants believe a subnet is building something valuable, they stake TAO into it. Those inflows strengthen its emission share, which can attract more miners, more experimentation, more liquidity, and more development. So TAO becomes something more than just a token. It becomes the routing layer of economic conviction. It's the mechanism through which the network collectively says this area deserves more energy. So what is TAO actually used for? Well, at a basic level, several things. First, it's the base asset of the entire network. It's the token emitted by the protocol to reward participants. Second, it's used for staking. Participants stake TAO into subnets to gain exposure to the subnet economies. Third, it acts as the capital allocation layer. TAO flows help determine which subnets receive more emission energy. And finally, it acts as the monetary glue, connecting many different subnet markets under one shared economic system. So TAO is at the same time a reward asset a staking asset, a routing asset, and the monetary base of the entire ecosystem. And just like Bitcoin, there will only ever be 21 million TAO tokens. To make this more concrete, let's look at a few examples. I know that this might sound pretty vague to people who are not really used to these kind of tokenomics. So let's have a look at some of the subnets on Bittensor. Take a subnet like Red Team. This subnet focuses on cybersecurity challenges. Miners compete to submit code solutions that solve technical security problems. Instead of one company funding a large internal research team, the subnet creates an open competitive environment. Participants build solutions, validators evaluate them, and the network distributes rewards. So the subnet effectively becomes a continuous research environment. Companies can then focus on integrating and deploying the best results. The exploration layer happens inside the subnet. So miners basically come up with new ways to bypass security, okay? And validators score those different methods. The subnet, or the people behind the subnet, they can basically compare all these proposed new strategies and adapt their products so that their products are really up to date and are resistant against all new forms of cybersecurity risks. And because this happens in Bittensor, it's a continuously evolving product, and the subnet team can very quickly update their product, which is pretty exciting actually. Another example is Yanes MIID. I don't know how to pronounce this one. I always call it Yanes. This subnet focuses on generating synthetic identities used to test financial crime detection systems. Think about fraud detection, anti-money laundering workflows, and compliance systems. These industries need enormous amounts of high-quality test data. Instead of building every dataset internally, the subnet creates a global experimentation environment. Miners generate and improve data. Validators enforce quality. And the resulting intelligence can be integrated into real compliance products. Again, the exploration layer becomes decentralized. And just like Red Team, Yanes is able to continuously update their products because they get input all the time from their miners, finding new ways basically to bypass certain security methods. And it's simply very hard to compete with a subnet like Yanes or Red Team because as a competitor you don't have access to all the products that miners basically produce, all the work that miners produce. Then I want to show you another example of a very interesting subnet, which is very different, by the way, than those previous two. It's called Bitcast. And this one is fascinating for a different reason. Bitcast creates a decentralized market connecting brands and content creators. Brands publish briefs. Creators produce videos or posts on X, for example. Validators verify engagement and analytics. And rewards are distributed through the network. So instead of a traditional marketing agency coordinating everything, the protocol becomes the coordination layer. It's a completely different way of organizing the creator economy. And it shows that the underlying idea of Bittensor is not limited to AI models. It's about whether protocol incentives can coordinate productive work more efficiently in certain domains. And very concretely, it works like this. Imagine there's a brand that basically wants to promote a product. They can contact Bitcast. They can write a brief, and then people from all over the globe who are, for example, active on YouTube, content creators, or on X, can basically produce videos or posts on X about this product. It's automatically scanned by AI. Does it contain all the necessary information, amongst other factors? If it gets a lot of engagement, if a lot of people watch the video, for example, or see the tweet, then the miners, because in this case the content creators are the miners, get rewarded instantly. They get paid in TAO or in the subnet token of Bitcast, which they can sell for TAO if they want to. So it's very interesting because you basically take away the middleman. So Why does all of this matter for TAO? Well, because if this ecosystem actually becomes meaningful, TAO sits at the very center of it. It's the monetary layer through which capital flows into subnet economies. It's the asset used to express conviction. It's the unit connecting all these different markets together. So people hold TAO not just because it's the token, but because it represents exposure to the base layer of this experimental economy. If you believe subnet markets will grow, TAO becomes very, very difficult to bypass. Now, of course, that doesn't automatically mean the price must go up. This is where it's important to stay honest, because strong architecture alone does not create real demand. Real demand comes from real utility. And the key question is simple. Do enough subnets build valuable things that capital continues flowing through TAO? If the answer is yes, then the monetary design becomes very powerful. If the answer is no, the system risks becoming elegant but mostly speculative. If real utility emerges inside the system, strong monetary architecture can capture that value. And that's a much more grounded thesis. So if I had to compress this entire episode into a single sentence, it would be this. TAO is the monetary layer of a decentralized experiment in organizing useful digital work through incentives. That's why it exists. That's why Bittensor needs it. And that's why people sometimes compare it to Bitcoin. Because if this network really works, TAO is not sitting on the side of the machine. It's helping coordinate the machine itself. And that machine is trying to organize the production of intelligence, compute, data, security, content, and perhaps entirely new forms of digital labor. It does so via incentives. That's the bet. And that machine is trying to organize the production of intelligence, compute, data, security, content, and perhaps entirely new forms of digital labor. And if these subnets succeed, or even if some subnets succeed, it will basically be inevitable that the price of TAO is going to go up as well. Because as I mentioned before, TAO is needed for everything within the Bittensor ecosystem. I don't want to go too deep today into the tokenomics, but I can mention this. For subnets, eventually, to stay competitive, they are basically more or less required to support their own subnet token, because every subnet has their own subnet token, and you can only get exposure to the subnet token through TAO. You swap your TAO for the subnet token. And so take the following example. One of the subnets I mentioned, like Bitcast, might become very famous. And people think, hey, I want to invest in this subnet. How can I invest in the subnet? Well, they can buy the subnet token. But to do so, they first have to buy TAO. And that's the very, very interesting and important characteristic of Bittensor, in contrast to many other protocols, including Ethereum. It's really at the center of it all. You can't really bypass TAO. And by the way, why do subnets need to support their own subnet token? Well, because if they don't, they risk losing miners and stakers and so emissions. Because as I mentioned before, the market decides which subnet gets emissions and which subnets don't. So if a subnet wants to attract emissions, which is extremely useful for the subnet because it's basically free money they can use to do R&D, they actually need to enable people to stake their TAO into their subnet. This is what provides emissions. Without it, there's no emissions to the subnet. So it's very important for subnets to convince the market that it takes its subnet token extremely serious. For example, it could announce buyback and burns. It could use revenue it generates to buy back its own token and burn it, for example. There are other methods as well. And to explain this very simply, when they do this, they basically increase the price of the subnet token, meaning they have more emissions coming in, and this makes miners happy, and it makes people who stake their TAO into the subnet happy as well. This, by the way, is a topic of another episode because it's rather technical, but it's very important. And the key message here, I repeat this again, is this. TAO sits at the center of this ecosystem. If subnets succeed, it's almost unimaginable that the price of TAO is not going to go up. I have more information about the tokenomics on my website, discoverbittensor.com, so you can check that out. And I will dedicate another episode to this topic because it's very important to understand. So I hope that this episode helps you understand a little bit more of. So I hope this episode made you understand Bittensor and the TAO token a little bit better, because it's rather complex for newcomers to instantly understand all the different details of Bittensor and TAO. It's really complicated, and also for me it's really complicated to explain everything. Most of it is pretty technical, and you cannot really bypass all these technical things if you really want to make people understand Bittensor. So, well, I do my best, and I hope that some of you have learned something today, and I hope some of you have understood a little bit more about the tokenomics, about TAO flow, and about this unique idea that Bittensor basically has introduced to the world, taking the core design of Bitcoin and turning it into something even better, in my opinion. Instead of just securing the network, in the case of Bitcoin, let's use miners to create useful stuff, in this case mostly digital commodities. And this is a really radical idea, and I think it is one of the most powerful ideas out there in general. This might sound very absurd to some people, but I do think so. So let's see how this all plays out in the coming years. We have to be patient. If you want to dive deeper into Bittensor, have a look at my website, discoverbittensor.com. And thanks a lot for tuning in. And I hope to see you all for the next episode. Bye bye.